All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down tonight. Thank you for braving the inclement weather to see our speaker this evening. As you can see from these lights and these microphones and these cameras, we are live streaming this event on the internet tonight. So a note for our internet audience at home: if at any point during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can just call the number on your screen. We will have the author sign it for you, and we will ship it to you wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Also, during the question and answer period, if you would like to place a question for Ms. Parker, again, if you call the number on your screen or right there on the internet, we could get your question to her during the Q&A. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to present Ms. Emily Parker and her special guests. Presenting her new book, Now I Know Who My Comrades Are, Voices from the Internet Underground. Ms. Parker is a digital diplomacy advisor and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. Previously, she was a member of Secretary Clinton's policy planning staff at the State Department, where she covered 21st century statecraft, innovation, and technology. Before joining the State Department, she was an op-ed editor at the New York Times and an editorial writer and op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal. Authoritarian governments try to isolate individuals from one another, but in the age of Twitter and Facebook, this is impossible. Social media helps people overcome feelings of powerlessness, leading to the rise of a new kind of citizen. In this book, Ms. Parker details how prominent dissidents and ordinary citizens use the internet to expose injustices and challenge authority. It is a testament to the power of community in the face of repression. This book has been getting some wonderful reviews. I have a quote here from Leslie Gelb, the President Emeritus of the Council of Foreign Relations. He says, "The heroes of this terrific book are internet foot soldiers, and these soldiers are changing China, Cuba, and Russia, and the world." Emily Parker is among a handful of the most promising new foreign policy commentators who weave together technology, culture, society, and politics with hard facts and clear analysis. Please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Emily Parker.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. So I quickly want to introduce my two wonderful guests here, who I will not make them talk because they don't want to today, but Yaremis Flores and Laritza Diversent, who are two of the stars of this book. And I'm going to read a little bit about them, and then if you have questions, please feel free to ask them after the presentation. Okay. So my book, thank you for that kind of introduction. My book deals with three different countries: China, Cuba, and Russia. Since we're in Miami, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Cuba section. Okay. So I'm just going to read a brief bit from Cuba, and then I'll give some more background. Okay. Okay. You never know who is who. I heard this warning often in Cuba. I hadn't been with Laritza Diversent for 15 minutes when a man sat down nearby. He was wearing sunglasses, cotton pants, and a polo shirt. He looked to be in his 40s. He made himself comfortable in his seat and then proceeded to do precisely nothing. We were at a nearly empty cafe at the Hotel Nacional in Havana, surrounded by palm trees and sand-colored stone archways. Laritza was describing the challenges of being a lawyer and a critical blogger in one of the most repressive countries in the world. I nervously speared my fork into soggy pizza and shifted my gaze toward the man at the next table, but Laritza didn't seem to notice him. After her name first appeared on the web, Laritza told me later, Cuban authorities began studying her as if she were a laboratory rat. When I made the decision to write, I was aware that they would rummage around in my past, particularly for personal secrets that I might have. There is really no way to know how and when they search for and obtain information about you. I asked her if she wanted to order something, but she had no interest in eating. Instead, she launched into an animated description of how her blog, Laritza's Laws, tried to educate people about the rights that Cuban authorities trampled upon every day. The man shifted in his chair. Laritza was born in 1980. When we first met, in 2009, she was wearing a long black skirt and a conservative button-down shirt, and she had her hair tightly pulled black. She had a pretty face with a straight nose and expressive eyes. She was calm, poised, and extremely aware. She spoke in rapid-fire Spanish and didn't lower her voice. I envied Laritza's composure. I was an American in Havana, spending the day with a known dissident under constant police surveillance. I was already picturing myself being hauled to the airport, another unwanted journalist deported to the United States. "Let's go," I told Laritza, who shrugged in agreement. I went inside the restaurant and hastily paid the bill. "Who was that guy?" I asked her once we had left the cafe. "I think he was just a foreigner," she said. "Really? Are you sure?" "No." I had read Laritza's blog in the United States, but setting up a meeting with her had not been easy. She only had intermittent internet access, and our phone connections were fuzzy if the calls got through at all. Laritza and I left the cafe and strolled on the grass behind the hotel. We sat down on a bench that was far away from the building, and I was relieved to see grass on all sides. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a young man in athletic clothes pacing the rear grounds of the hotel. He was lean and muscular and carrying either a cell phone or a walkie-talkie. He began walking in our general direction, staying about 30 feet away. He gave us a sideways glance, then turned on his heel and headed back toward the hotel. "Now that guy," Laritza said, "he's definitely security." She told me he was going to the hotel to report what he had seen. What is he going to say? He'll say that there is a Cuban talking to a foreigner. Whenever I went out with Laritza, we were never quite alone. A man would sit down at a nearby table and stare straight ahead, or thumb listlessly through a newspaper. Someone would come over to our table and ask for the time, or perhaps a cigarette. Who were these people? Were they threatening, or just chatty and a little bored? The answer wasn't black and white. In Cuba, the line between state informer and ordinary neighbor is razor thin, if it exists at all. So that's just a little backdrop to what it's like to be a blogger in Cuba. I just want to read a little bit more about Laritza, a little bit more about Laritza's writing. "I write a blog because I can't access my country's media," Laritza wrote in 2009. "It is the only way that I have to tell Sonia's life. She is a 20-year-old woman who prostitutes herself in the capital streets. It's about explaining why she abandoned her studies and the motivations she has for her tomorrow. It's about communicating the anxieties that plague Roberto, a young man who does not work for the state, but spends his days sitting on a park bench. Why there are thousands of workers who steal from their jobs. Why there is so much delinquency and alcoholism. This is a reality that the official media tries to conquer because they are forbidden to explain why. This is a truth that the government hides." Laritza's decision to become an independent journalist, which can serve as a euphemism for dissident, radically changed her relationship with the state. She wasn't revealing state secrets or even telling people what they did not already know. She was doing something far more threatening. Fear was the Cuban authorities' most powerful weapon, and Laritza had declared herself immune. She was also attempting, in her own modest way, to rewrite the story of her nation. Words like Cuba and revolution had become propagandistic abstractions that had little to do with the actual people of the country. Laritza described blogs as, quote, "the place where we give life to our land, where it stops being Cuba and it becomes the Cuban people, flesh and blood people with their own existence. Laritza said she started her blog in an attempt to show my country as I see it and as I feel it. So that's a little introduction to Laritza right there. So after I met Laritza, I think maybe 2 years after meeting Laritza, I met Yeremis, who was learning to be a blogger. Laritza was training her to be a blogger. And I'm going to read a little bit about Yeremis. Yeremis was formerly a judge in Cuba and became very disappointed with the Cuban judicial system and turned to blogging. And once she turned to blogging, she found herself being painted as a dissident. So I'm going to read a little bit about Yeremis. Yeremis got into some trouble in Cuba. We're going to read about that. Okay. Cuba has two kinds of people. There are the independent bloggers and other liberated individuals who glide confidently through the streets, willing to tell pretty much anyone what they think. Then there's everyone else. When I first met Yeremis in 2011, I could see that she had already moved over to the other side. Once you cross that threshold of fear, she told me, you can't go back. Yeremis said she felt protected. We have a strong weapon, she said of the internet. She understood that she was not yet famous. She also knew, however, that, quote, if anything happens to me, I can call Laritza, and everyone will know that I was detained. Less than a year later, this is exactly what happened. In November 2012, I was sitting at my desk in New York City, casually scrolling through my Twitter feed. Yoani Sanchez was tweeting up a storm, as usual. It was hardly extraordinary to see tweets about some dissident in Cuba who had been arrested or even beaten. But this time I saw a message that made me jolt upright in my chair. Yeremis Flores had been arrested. I soon learned that Laritza and others went to the state security building to find out what happened to Yeremis. They were promptly arrested too. So another group of activists, including Yoani, set out to inquire not only about Yeremis, but about Laritza and the others. That group was arrested as well. In total, more than 24 people were detained. I watched all this from New York, practically in real time, via Twitter and other websites. Earlier that day, Yeremis had left her house to bring soup to her father, who was in the hospital. She was crossing the street when she heard a car brake sharply. Inside the car was an agent from state security and 2 police officers. The state security agent identified himself as Tomas, although that was not necessarily his real name. He called Yeremis by her name and said, "You have to come with us and turn off your cell phone." Yeremis replied that she had a right to make a phone call. She immediately called Laritza. Yeremis didn't cry or demonstrate any signs of nervousness. "I don't know where the calm came from," she said. She told Laritza that she was being detained, but she didn't know where they were taking her. She also made a point of telling Laritza the identifying numbers on the shirts of the 2 police officers, as well as the number of the police car. She knew that in cases of arbitrary detention, these were critical pieces of information. Laritza, on the receiving end of the call, was far less calm than her friend. "¿Qué?" she shouted into the receiver. "¿Cómo?" Then Laritza was led into the back seat of the police car. When she asked Tomas about her destination, he replied, "You'll see where we take you. I felt like meeting you, and today you're going to find out who I am." Yeremis was accused of disseminating false information against international peace. This was apparently in reference to an article on the Miami-based CubaNet website that quoted Yeremis as saying that some prisoners died in a prison in Santiago de Cuba. Yeremis said she had no way to confirm if this was true or not. She was only repeating what other sources had told her. Yeremis believed that the CubaNet article was an excuse. She said that once she was detained, the authorities brought up her other internet articles. She thought she was targeted because she was relatively new to dissidents. Arresting Yoani, or even Laritza, would get the attention of Cuban exiles and the international human rights community. They didn't think that so many people would pay attention to me, Yaremi said. This turned out to be a serious miscalculation. As soon as Laritza got Yaremi's call, she sprang into action. She had copied down the numbers of the police officers and also of the police car. She called a police information phone line and demanded to know where Yaremi's had been taken. But it appeared as if Yaremi's wasn't in any police station. So if you want to know what happened, you'll just have to get the book. So that's just a brief introduction to these two incredibly brave women who are bloggers from Cuba and are spending a brief time in Miami. So I'll just talk very briefly about the internet in Cuba and give some background, and then if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So Cuba has remarkably low internet penetration. According to some statistics, in 2012, Cuba, there were 5% of Cubans online. When you think about that, that's really crazy. So 5% of Cubans had access to the World Wide Web. Official figures are higher, and there were probably more Cubans using what's called the intranet, which is kind of an internal internet. So you have 5% of Cubans that are online, and one of the reasons for this is because it's prohibitively expensive for Cubans to use the internet. So Yaremi's and Laritza and other bloggers, what they'll do is they'll write their blog posts on computers at home, and they'll save them on flash drives, and then they will take those flash drives to an embassy or to a hotel where they have internet access and then send them from there. Other bloggers have their blogs hosted overseas. So in order to be a blogger in Cuba, you have to be pretty creative, you have to be resourceful, and you really have to be very determined to do it. I think that Cuba is in the midst of a very serious dilemma, because on the one hand, you have the Cuban government that really wants economic reform and is trying to open up Cuba to a certain degree. You're always hearing about economic reforms in Cuba, and last year they opened up 118 internet salons, apparently in an attempt to connect Cuba to the outside world. However, Cuba is facing the dilemma that all authoritarian regimes face, which is, we want some sort of economic integration, but we don't want to give up any of the control that we have over the population. So what we're seeing in Cuba is they're bringing in the internet incrementally, but completely on their own terms. And, people ask me all the time, why is the internet so limited in Cuba? Some people blame the U.S. embargo. Some people blame other factors. There are many factors that are keeping internet limited, but I think the Cuban government is not entirely comfortable with the majority of the population having access to online tools. The one thing that I tried to explore in this book is that the section on Cuba is about fear. And one of the things that you hear in Cuba over and over again, and I tried to give a little taste of that in this reading, is this sense of you never know who is who. You never know who is sitting at the next table. You never know who your neighbor is. You never know who that person is in the cafe. Anybody could be an informer, and anybody can inform on you at any time. And this kind of leads to a sense of abstract paranoia that really keeps Cubans from speaking openly to anybody. And I've, traveled a lot to various authoritarian countries, and I never really experienced anything like I saw in Cuba, where people were so nervous to say what they really think. So this raises the question, why does the internet matter in Cuba? Why does the internet matter if only 5% of Cubans can actually see it? The internet matters in Cuba, and this is what I learned from these two women here, is because the internet helps ordinary people get over those fears. So if you are born in Cuba and you are brought up to always think about what you say and to always be careful who you talk to and to always show up at the right meetings and to always be politically correct, you're constantly censoring yourselves. And I think for the bloggers that I met in Cuba, writing a blog was the first time that they were able to speak directly and to tell the world as they really see it. And I think for a lot of people, that was a very empowering phenomenon. The other thing about Cuba, about the Cuban internet that's important is, even if Cubans are not reaching the majority of their countrymen, they are able to reach people outside of the country. And so this has been a really interesting phenomenon. You have Cuban bloggers who are communicating directly with the Cuban exile community, some of them getting in touch with family members that they hadn't spoken to for years. And this also creates a sense of protection around them. So there was a time when if a Cuban blogger, like Yaremi's was arrested, nobody would know about it. She would totally disappear. Now, it's much harder to do that because other bloggers will blog about it and other people will know about it. And this creates a little bit of protection around individual bloggers and makes them part of an international community. And quickly, and Cuba, just to compare to the other two countries in the book, I look at Cuba, China, and Russia. All three of these countries control the internet in very different ways. China, for example, has something like 600 million people online. So there's Cuba here and there's China here. They're on totally other ends of the spectrum. And China controls the internet via censorship, Great Firewall of China, surveillance. I mean, they have a very extensive censorship mechanism. I think one of the big questions about Cuba going forward is if Cuba will adapt this Chinese model. I think that's something that people are wondering, if Cuba does get more access to the internet, will the Cuban government actually start monitoring it more heavily than they do now? And I think that's one possible trajectory for Cuba. But I also think that it's inevitable that Cubans are going to become more connected. I think that's just a fact of the 21st century economy. So anyway, I don't know if anyone has questions. I don't want to just talk forever. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned China and a brief comparison to Cuba. From the outside looking in, my understanding is that many internet users in China are using euphemisms and their own internal vocabulary and language to describe things, and everyone knows what it means. Does that happen in Cuba also, or are the bloggers and internet users deliberately choosing to be much more direct in their language?
That's an interesting question. I have not observed that so much in Cuba, just because Cuba doesn't have the same level of censorship that China does. So it's true that Chinese netizens are using kind of code words. They're purposely misspelling words. One famous example is June 4th, which is the anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown of 1989. June 4th is a very sensitive term on the Chinese internet. So instead of saying June 4th, Chinese netizens will say May 35th. That's just one example of very creative uses of getting around. In Cuba, because Cuba regulates the internet not so much by censorship but by access, I haven't noticed that so much. It's like once Cubans get online, they can pretty much say what they want. I mean, there are examples of blocked sites, but it's not the same thing as in China where you have filtered keywords, right? Where certain words, if you write, they just won't even appear on the screen. That's not something that I've observed in Cuba now. I'm not saying that it won't happen though. that might be the next step, but that's more of a Chinese phenomenon. And in Russia, the other country in this book, Russia also is quite interesting. Russia doesn't have the same level of censorship as China, but Russian authorities control the internet largely via legal means. There's a lot of, they'll say you're breaking the law, and they'll block websites because they'll say this website is harmful to children, or this website is promoting extremism. But many people suspect that that's just an excuse to block websites that the government doesn't like. So all three countries monitor the internet in very different ways. China largely via censorship, Cuba via restricting access, and Russia via legal means or just via intimidating bloggers. Yes?
What are the sites that are blocked in Cuba now?
That's a good question. Do you want to answer that? Sites that are blocked in Cuba.
¿Cómo?
The sites that you can't access in Cuba.
Los sitios a los que podemos acceder.
A los que no se puede acceder.
Bueno, cuando nos conectamos en Cuba es en los hoteles, porque no tenemos internet en nuestras casas, y esos sitios bloquean ciertas páginas como por ejemplo Nuevo Herald, Radio Martí, incluso Univisión. Son páginas a las que no se puede acceder porque hablan de la realidad de lo que está pasando en Cuba, critican o exponen la realidad de lo que hace el gobierno cubano. Entonces son sitios a los que no se puede acceder. Se puede acceder a Ecurred, que es una página creada por ellos mismos donde incluso tergiversan los términos y lo que realmente ocurre.
Ms. Parker, maybe you'd like to give a quick summary for the internet audience about what is blocked and what is not blocked.
So, let me also explaining that, because most Cubans can't access the internet in their house and they're accessing it from hotels. So you said Univision is blocked? Yeah, Univision, Radio Martí, right? I'm sorry, what were the others? Yeah. What about English language publications? Not so much, right?
No.
Yeah, not so much. It's mostly sensitive Spanish language publications that are being blocked. English language publications are relatively easy to.
Es todo lo que sea crítico con el gobierno, con lo que diga la realidad de lo que pasa.
Yeah, anything basically that criticizes the government and talks about the reality of what's happening in Cuba is not going to stand a really good chance of surviving for long. Yes.
Technologically ignorant here. Why do these countries even allow the internet at all?
Yeah, that's not ignorant. I think that's kind of the dilemma we're facing. They allow the internet because they can't survive economically without it, right? And even you look at China. China's a perfect example of this. For a while, China was shut off from the world, under Mao Zedong or whatever. He had total control, but it was also very backward. And China now is a major economic power. And so they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. You can't keep your citizens totally off the internet and also try to play hardball economically, and that's what they're trying to do. And I think Cuba is facing that as well. I mean, you have Cuba talking about economic reforms and innovation and entrepreneurship, and you can't really do that if your citizens are totally disconnected from the global network. So that's why they kind of have no choice. But what a lot of these governments try to do is they allow the internet, but on their own terms, right? So they'll allow the internet, but they'll try to monitor it. And that's what China's been doing. And the truth is, China's been doing a pretty good job of it. I think when China first allowed the internet, people thought, oh, they're not going to stand a chance. But they kind of have been able to. And unfortunately, I think Cuba will eventually, if it lets in the internet on a greater scale, will probably follow that model. Yes?
In China, do you see freedom growing in the society in general and also in internet use and internet expression?
Definitely. I think I definitely see that. And so a lot of what this book looks at is how the internet has transformed China. So just to give a very basic example, in the internet age, the Chinese Communist Party can no longer completely control the flow of information. So I've been watching the Chinese internet since about 2004. And pretty much since then, there's always been these really aggressive attempts to control online dissent and to block websites and censor words. But information always gets through. That's what's really remarkable, is that every time the Chinese government has tried to take down a story, somebody has found a way to talk about it. And, there's just so many people on the internet. It's just impossible to there's so many people. I mean, there's more people on the Chinese internet than there are people in the United States, by a lot. So, yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot of people. And, when you have some major thing that happens, like a big train crash, there was an example of that. You just can't sweep it under the rug the way that you used to. And it's not only about information. I actually think what's more important about the internet in China is the way that it's promoting freedom of assembly or freedom of virtual assembly. So the Chinese government tries really hard to isolate its critics from one another. That's very important to them. After Tiananmen, 1989, people rising up all over China, the party said, we are not going to let this happen again. We are never going to let so many people come and take over the country in this way. That was a real threat to the Chinese government. And since then, they have been cracking down hard on any kind of physical assembly by groups that they distrust. So given that reality, it's actually quite significant that on the internet you have hundreds or thousands or even millions of people sort of joining forces in a way. And the title of the book, that's where the title of the book comes from, Now I Know Who My Comrades Are. In 2004, I met an internet dissident in Beijing, and I said to him, why does the Chinese internet matter if, everyone's censoring information all the time? And he said, because now I know who my comrades are, because now I know that I'm not alone. It used to be that if I disagreed with the government, there would be nobody, I would have no evidence that anyone agrees with me, but now I go online and I can find people who see the world the same way. And I think that's true a little bit in Cuba as well, right? You can go online and you can connect with larger networks of individuals, and that's a transformative experience for people.
Technical question.
Sure.
Between Russia and China, who would you say is the quote-unquote worse about internet censorship, or in terms of their technical capability to spy on you and the reach of the intelligence services to monitor what the citizens are doing on the internet?
Well, Russia has pretty impressive surveillance mechanisms. That's kind of their thing. But I think until recently, the Russians didn't really bother to control the internet. That's what's kind of interesting. So until actually very recently, the Russian internet was a relatively free place. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but there's no great firewall of Russia. There's not armies of internet censors, not like there is in China. You could kind of say what you wanted in Russia on the internet because ultimately the internet didn't really matter. It was sort of seen as this place where, hipsters and opposition figures and bloggers kind of played around, but they were no real threat to the government, so the government didn't really care. They just left the internet alone. What's fascinating is that that's starting to change. That's starting to change really since 2011, 2012, when tens of thousands of Russians were protesting in the streets. I think the Kremlin started changing their attitude about the internet and thought, well, actually, this is a little bit dangerous for us. So now you're starting to see, laws passed, again, ostensibly to protect children or fight extremism, but suddenly these websites are being blocked, and they don't even really need a court approval to do that. And just recently they've been blocking sites or blocking internet pages that are related to the Ukraine protests, for example. So you're seeing a lot of that in Russia, and it was never a big part of the story before. So Russia's catching up to China. That's an easy question, easy answer. Yes.
I wonder if you can compare the content between China and Cuba and Russia. I mean, is there a difference? Do bloggers take different approaches in Cuba versus China? More or less aggressive? How do you define the content?
That's a great question. It's a hard question because it's hard to generalize, especially when you're talking about like 600 million people who are all saying so many things. But yeah, I think the internet cultures are somewhat defined by the political cultures. So for example, China, because China has this extensive layer of censorship, in China you will see more like word games and more of your typical kind of dissident type of literature where people are like trying to get around the censors and are trying to get around the bottom line and they're talking in really tricky ways. You don't see that as much in Cuba and in Russia. In all three of these countries, you have a wide range of bloggers. So one question I get a lot is, are all these bloggers fighting for democracy? Of course not, right? In all of these places, you have like bad bloggers as well. I mean, you have nationalists you have violent people, you have fascists. So it really runs the gamut. But for the bloggers that I focus on in this book, who are kind of fighting for democracy or fighting for a more open country, yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities. In Cuba, I think there's a lot of emphasis on telling the real story of Cuba to the outside world. Because that's really, they're talking largely to the international audience. So I think like one thing you'll notice on the Cuban blogs a lot is this emphasis on, I'm going to tell the reality of the streets that you would not otherwise know. I think Cuban bloggers have this feeling that because the Cuban media has a monopoly on information, they're concerned that everybody outside of Cuba thinks that Cuba is this wonderful place with like great education and great healthcare and great literacy. And so I think Cuban bloggers really make a point of like telling the truth of the streets. So each of these, each of them have kind of different trademarks, but it's hard to summarize. It's a good question though. Yes?
I have two questions. One is a follow-up to your response. If the Cuban bloggers and internet users are largely speaking to the outside world, are the Chinese talking more to each other?
There's different kinds of Chinese activists. So I try to explore like the range of them. So there are, for example, there's two major social media sites that Chinese people use. One is Twitter, like the Twitter that we know. The other is Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter. And so Chinese netizens are divided by whether they use the domestic services or whether they use those international services. So Twitter, for example, is blocked in China. So if you want to get onto Twitter, you can, but you have to use technological tools. You have to like jump over the firewall, and you can do it. Those people are largely talking to the outside world. And there are Chinese bloggers, one of the bloggers in my book is like this, who really think it's more important to talk to like foreign media and more important to talk to embassies. I mean, he's really trying to like gain international support. But then there's other Chinese bloggers who only write in Chinese and they really write on the domestic sites. And their goal more is to rally the masses, to try to get through to the masses. So this is like the constant struggle in China. It's, do I write inside China and maybe change my message a little bit and be careful about what I say, but reach more people? Or do I talk to the outside world and I don't have to watch what I say because I'm outside of China, but I'm not reaching anyone inside of my country. So there's a real struggle, and my book kind of looks at one from each side who's made that decision.
And then the second question is, I don't know whether you considered this, but if you have, could you comment a little bit about the role of social media in, say, Egypt 2 years ago, and Iran, not during the latest electoral cycle, but going back one previous, and where there was a lot of unrest in the streets for an extended period of time?
Yeah, so those two are related in a way. So, Iran, 2009, everyone was so excited about it. They said there was like the Twitter revolution, and then all of a sudden that revolution was extinguished. And, that kind of led to a sense, at least here in America, that, the social media doesn't really work. And people became very negative about it because, I don't know if you remember, the coverage in Iran was really about this like vibrant opposition movement that all of a sudden seemed like it was wiped out, So it was interesting in Egypt. In the years between kind of Iran and Egypt, I think a lot of people were very negative about the role of the internet in fomenting protest. And so nobody was really paying attention to Egypt. But the truth is that in Egypt, in the years leading up to the revolution, there was actually a very active online culture. So I guess the argument that I make about Egypt is that social media did play an important role in the Egyptian revolution. It wasn't the only thing, but it played an important role. However, that role began like years before the revolution. It didn't start on January 24th or January 25th. For years, Egyptians were forming networks with each other. They were forming networks with the outside world. They were learning how to use social networking tools to organize protests. And so like when the revolutionary moment came, they were prepared for it. So that's kind of how I look at Egypt. The other thing about Egypt is, now people say, well, look at Egypt now. It's in such a bad situation. What is it social media's fault or something? And I think the thing to remember is that social media fueled revolutions like Egypt are very good for taking down a government. They're good for taking down a government because they're leaderless, right? And governments try to find that one leader and capture him and, decapitate him, and that's it. But in a case like Egypt, you had all these people all over the country, and it was very decentralized. So it was extremely difficult for the government to trace it and to stop it. So that kind of made the revolution succeed. However, the downside of a leaderless revolution is that once it succeeds, there are no leaders. And that's what we saw in Egypt, right? So, there really was no leader of the Egyptian revolution. It was kind of a Facebook, social networking thing, and that led to a lot of chaos. So I think online opposition movements around the world are looking at the Egypt example and thinking, how can we avoid this problem? Try to be a little bit more organized, try to have a little bit more of a plan, because social media can be very effective in taking something down. It's not always so effective in rebuilding something new.
The biggest flash mob ever.
Yeah, you could say that.
My question dovetails off of that, which, your book focuses on Cuba, Russia, and China. I wonder if, what would be the second tier of countries perhaps that also have an up-and-coming internet dissident presence?
Yeah, there's not that many of them that are like in this category. I mean, there's ones that are worse, like North Korea. North Korea has pretty much no internet to speak of. I mean, they really win the prize for just keeping the internet out of the country, but they're paying a supreme price for that. They're totally disconnected from the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea eventually faces that same dilemma, which is we can't stay disconnected forever. We have to let a little internet, but we want to have it our way. So they're kind of on the other extreme. Iran is dealing with this same kind of thing. There's definitely examples all over the world, but North Korea, Iran are big ones. I mean, North Korea is a totally its own category, but you see internet blackouts and all. I mean, even in Venezuela, right? I mean, in these recent protests, we saw internet blackouts and the government trying to control social media. So you see it actually, to be perfectly honest, you see it in democracies too. Even in the United States, in the United Kingdom, it's once all these governments that talk a lot about internet freedom, once they feel that their national security is at risk, they sort of sing a different tune. So. It really is something. I think this is a struggle for governments all over the world. These cases are maybe a little more extreme, but we have that same problem here as well.
Who's got the freest internet in the world?
I don't know. Probably it's always the Scandinavian countries. They win like everything. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to ask your impressions regarding China from
Sure.
the observations that you've done and having visited there. I get the impression, again, from the outside looking in, that there has been an impressive growth of freedom, and this sounds a little bit like my earlier question, but there's a different aspect of it. It seems like there's been an acceleration of freedom, let me put it that way, in the last 2-3 years, something like that, both within the society and also within the internet community. Is that your impression, or do you have a different impression?
No, I completely have that impression. Some people will say, well, but what about what about the crackdowns, and what about the censorship, and what about all these bloggers that are being intimidated? But my argument is that the reason the government is cracking down is because the internet is so powerful, right? If the internet wasn't so powerful, why would they spend so much time cracking down on it? You know, so you look at Weibo, for example. You know, Weibo is the domestic version of Twitter, and China has also hundreds of millions of users. And now it seems like it's a bit on the wane because the Chinese government has been going after Weibo very aggressively. But you know, Weibo at one time, you know, was really the only public square in China. It was like the one place where you could really reach the masses, and one person had equivalent power to a local newspaper, more power than a newspaper. You know, one person could send a message via his cell phone to 40 million people. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? That's really something. So this is just a world that was totally unimaginable to people before. And I think the internet has completely transformed China. And I also think that the repression of the internet is just more evidence of that. It's always going to be a cat and mouse game in China. You know, it's never going to be easy. And the government has really defied a lot of expectations and how comprehensive they've been, but they can't control it completely. They haven't been able to control it completely.
It seems to me that even though there are sporadic attempts at crackdown, that nevertheless the bars to freedom are being expanded outward.
Yeah.
Constantly.
I think that's definitely true.
Happening?
Yeah, I do think that's happening, and I think people are just demanding more and more. You know, they're just demanding more and more. You know, they want to say more, they want to read more, they want to see more, and so yeah, I think there's just a lot more. There's just greater expectations among the population for what they're entitled to.
All right.
Good.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so if there are no more questions, a reminder for our internet audience that there's still time to call the number on your screen. Purchase a copy of your book. We'll have it signed and shipped to you. Also, a note, all of our live-streamed events are archived. So if you do not catch the broadcast live, you can go to the Books and Books website, go to the live streaming link, and everything that has been broadcast here on the internet will be archived there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter over there. Ms. Parker is going to be signing over here at the table to the left of the podium. That was fascinating. Please give her and her special guest a round of applause. Thank you very much.